thanks to all of you for joining us today. Obviously, it's been a very exciting time lately, exciting, fascinating, kind of overwhelming time in the Middle East, especially for those of us who focus on issues of democracy and human rights, as our organization does. We put this event together rather hastily in reaction to events. We expected it was going to be a timely event. We didn't know it now appears that we may be sort of going head-to-head with President Mubarak, who is currently scheduled to speak in about 30 minutes to make an announcement, and that most people are expecting he may be announcing they'll be stepping down. My guess is, based on precedents over the last few weeks, every time there's been they've announced that he's going to be giving a big speech, it's always come at least 45 minutes later than they first announced it. So it may be he may wait until we're finished and then make his announcement. But we'll see. And in any case, as I said, obviously this is sort of an exciting, interesting, fascinating time. Lots of changes going on in the region, and while the news has been overwhelmingly focused on Egypt lately, and that'll be probably the bulk of our discussion today, we also want to look a little more broadly, and that what's happening in the region is certainly not confined to Egypt alone. And the most recent events, haven't actually begun in Egypt, but began before that in Tunisia. Looking back over the last couple of years, our organization and a lot of others in town have sort of expressed a lot of concern about sort of movements, shifts in many of the country's trends across the region in the last few years of sort of increasing desire for political participation, increasing mobilization of populations at a time of also sort of increasing repression from the government's regimes. And this was sort of seen as, by many, as inherently unstable and inevitably likely to lead to some sort of clash and explosion, as we've seen lately. I remember we had an event here on the Hill almost 2 years ago, and we had Tom Malinowski also speaking when we released a report on Egypt, talking about the situation in Egypt being unsustainable in the long term, the status quo of the authoritarian regime remaining in place as a population that was increasingly young and restive and mobilized was sort of increasing. And we sort of made policy recommendations at that time to try to help the U.S. government to encourage reform in Egypt. Unfortunately, that hasn't taken place over the last couple of years. I was just going to say a couple words about the last few weeks from my perspective, our perspective, and then I'll introduce our three speakers that we're excited to have here today to speak. I was actually in the region a few weeks ago as a lot of the protests were coming to a head in Tunisia. I spent a week in Doha. I was there for a meeting of the Forum for the Future, which brought together about 150 civil society activists from across the Middle East and North Africa for several days of meetings, along with foreign ministry officials. And obviously, the discussion in the meetings that week were dominated by events in Tunisia. And on the last day of the conference, Secretary Clinton was there, and she spoke. And she had some remarks that were seen as sort of rather blunt and critical of the region's regimes. Her remarks included comments such as, in too many places, in too many ways, the region's foundations are sinking into the sand. And she went on to say that those who cling to the status quo may be able to hold back the full impact of their country's problems for a little while, but not forever. If leaders don't offer a positive vision and give young people meaningful ways to contribute, others will fill the vacuum. When she said that the leaders may be able to hold back the impact of their problems for a little while, I think it has turned out to be even a littler while than she imagined. That evening at the same conference, I was watching live in a hotel room in Doha with one of the leading Tunisian human rights activists that we work with, and we watched as President Ben Ali went on TV and gave a live address to his people, and it was one of the more striking addresses that I've ever seen. It was a dictator, an autocrat who had ruled his country harshly for 23 years, essentially going on television and begging his population to let him stay on a bit longer, and offering him everything that they demanded except himself, and saying, I won't run again when my term is up in 2014, and I'll make all these reforms, and I'll get rid of censorship, and I'll do everything you've asked. If you all, but I'd like to stay on. And his tone was radically different from that I've ever seen from an Arab autocrat. And it was fascinating as well. The speech ended, and Amin Ghali, the Tunisian activist that I was watching this speech with, it ended, and so then there was this question, are the Tunisian people going to accept all of this, or do they want, are they going to say, no, that's not enough, it's too late, you have to go. And Amin took out his laptop within a few minutes after the speech ended, and he opened it up, and he went on Facebook, and there were about, he's very connected in the activist community and elsewhere in Tunisia, and he had about 800 posts in the last 5 minutes from people, and we scrolled down them, and they were in a mix of Arabic and French, and about 90 to 95% of them were saying, no, this is too late, you should have said this years ago, or a month ago, you might have saved yourself, but it's too late, and you're going tomorrow. And we could, within 5 to 10 minutes, we could see the population using technology to answer, to give their answer to his speech and say no. The next day he did, in fact, step down. I actually flew the day that he stepped down. I flew from Doha to Cairo, and I arrived in Egypt for 3 days. And when I was there, I met with a lot of our partners and human rights activists and democracy reformers in Egypt. And what I heard constantly for 3 days was, I could see that community was energized and excited by the events in Tunisia. And I heard repeatedly, we're going to make this happen here. Since I have left, we've essentially seen that happen. I think that the activists and the reformers in Egypt were always, were wanting this, and what happened in Tunisia allowed them to organize protest and be joined by large segments of the population that had not been as politically engaged, and that gave these protests life that they would not have had previously. But before turning it over to our panelists, I'll just add that although the events of the last few weeks and now what appears to be the pending resignation of President Mubarak are, things that most people would not have imagined, 6 weeks ago that would have happened in this time, I would add that it's a very long road ahead, and that, the transition to democracy is still a very difficult path in both of those countries. And we've got 3 outstanding experts here today. I think 3 of the best people we could have to address kind of the challenges that are faced by the countries in the region, how the events in Tunisia and Egypt will impact the region as a whole, and particularly how this will impact U.S. policy and U.S. relations with the region, and what U.S. policy can and should be, in the months ahead to help assist and support transitions to democracies in Tunisia and Egypt, and hopefully other countries that will follow. Today, our first speaker today is going to be Tom Malinowski, who is the Washington director of Human Rights Watch. He's someone who has really led the fight over the last couple of years for kind of awareness of the need for reform in Egypt, including here in the Hill and with the administration. And we're excited to have him speak. Our second speaker will be Larry Diamond, who is a senior fellow at the Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and he's really one of the top experts on democratic transitions. And in addition to kind of talking about the recent events that we've seen, I think he'll kind of draw on some lessons from democratic transitions in other places, as in terms of what we might expect to see, and as well as lessons for U.S. policy. And then our third speaker will be Mona Yacoubian. She's a senior advisor at the USIP, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and she's manages their Lebanon working group. She's really a regional expert that I think will be able to offer valuable insight on kind of what the events mean in Egypt and Tunisia for the rest of the region, and how it's likely to particularly impact U.S. relations with the region as a whole. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tom.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you all for coming. As you said, it's a very exciting moment, and things are changing every minute. And I have spent the last 2 weeks glued to my television and my telephone and my email rather than preparing talks. So I'll share a few thoughts that came to me in the taxi on the way here, and hopefully we can have a little bit of discussion and then see what happens next. I'm also, I think, going to rebel a little bit in the spirit of Tahrir Square against your title here, after the uprisings. I think the important thing we need to keep in mind right now is that we're not after anything yet. We're in the middle. Nothing here is over. Nothing is settled. Things could go very well. Things could go extremely badly. Let's assume for a moment that the news that went out a couple of hours ago is true, and that President Mubarak is in some fashion stepping aside and in some fashion transferring authority to the Egyptian military. That obviously would satisfy one of the central demands of the folks who have been demonstrating on Tahrir Square. But in some ways, it's the least fundamental of their demands. And one can certainly imagine a scenario in which the Egyptian military and the central power brokers within the Egyptian government around President Mubarak would decide that the time has come to concede the dictator in an effort to preserve the dictatorship. That by giving the crowd the head of Mubarak, they will be able to disperse it, divide it, while continuing to slow down the process of fundamental structural reform that I think everybody recognizes is necessary to change Egypt and to address the real concerns of the broad range of people who have been coming out and demonstrating in the last few weeks. What those steps are, I think, is very plain. And to its credit, the Obama administration in the last week has been quite specific in communicating both publicly and privately to the Egyptian government what it expects to see happen. First and foremost, for example, lifting of the emergency law in Egypt, which is the legal regime under which the security services of the country can arrest, detain, torture, disappear anyone they want for whatever reason they want without any legal checks. The beginnings of constitutional changes that are necessary for the holding of free and fair elections in Egypt, reforming laws on the media and communications that would allow for freedom of expression, and a transitional process that is inclusive of the opposition, rather than what we have seen in the last week, a process in which the government invites a selected group of people for dialogue and then announces unilaterally what it is prepared to do and what it is not prepared to do to meet their demands. So right now, I mean, especially because there will be euphoria about the departure of Mubarak, it's extremely important for everybody to stay focused on those concrete structural legal issues that are at the heart of this crisis. And here I think President Obama has positioned himself quite well. The line that he has been repeating and that the administration has been repeating, that this is not ultimately about who rules Egypt. We as the United States shouldn't be talking about who should rule Egypt. That line, which was sort of awkward for the administration for 2 or 3 weeks, that seemed strained to many people because it was not addressing the most vocal demand of the protesters that Mubarak should leave, starting today is exactly the right message. And in some ways, I'm glad that the president stuck to it, because we need to remember it's not about who rules Egypt or any of the other countries we're concerned about. It's about how they are ruled. And I really don't think we are out of the woods at all. I think the core power brokers in the country have not changed. I think they have an enormous stake still in preserving the status quo. For many of them, this is a life or death battle to preserve everything that they have become accustomed to over many decades. And my expectation is that they will continue to fight, perhaps to the death, to defend that system. And so maintaining pressure on the government and on particularly the military of Egypt will be extremely important in the days and weeks ahead. A second point I would make is that the United States does have influence here. You will often hear from American diplomats the truism that, well, our influence is limited, and this is all for Egyptians to decide, not for us to decide. Of course, all of that is true. There is no country in the world where the United States has unlimited influence. The challenge is always to use what you have to try to maximize the chance of the outcome that you want. But I'm absolutely convinced that last week, when we saw the Egyptian government turning on the violence and then turning off the violence, as if there was a button that it could press on and off, that the all-hands-on-deck effort by the administration to try to influence the government, and particularly the military of Egypt, was at least one factor in their decision to press the off button, and which has in turn allowed the demonstrations to continue. I wouldn't argue that it was the primary factor, but I do think that it is a factor. It's a factor, for the sort of obvious reason that there is this enormously important military-to-military relationship. There's the $1.3 billion in assistance every year, which is important, obviously, for the recipients of that assistance to maintain. But I think it's also important, and perhaps even more important, for psychological reasons. Whether you believe the United States, whether rationally one can argue that the United States has a lot of leverage in a country or Egypt or not, the fact is everyone in Egypt believes the United States is a player. Everyone believes the United States has leverage, both on the government side and on the street. And if everyone believes we do, we do. It's that simple. And statements that are made, both privately and publicly, by the administration play into the psychology of both sides and have some effect on their morale, on whether or not they believe that they can win if you're a protester, whether or not they believe they can hold on if you're in the government. And that, I think, that experience is something that we can extrapolate from Egypt to a lot of other countries where the United States has similar psychological influence, at the very least. And then finally, I would say, although I want to mostly talk about Egypt, that this does have implications far beyond Egypt. I think POMED's focus has been on the rest of the Middle East and the Arab world. I don't think actually we should be limited to that when we think about the consequences of these events. I know people in Russia, in China, in Burma, in Uzbekistan, in Belarus, all over the world, are watching to see what happens in Egypt and drawing conclusions from it. Opposition movements obviously draw hope from it. It makes it more likely that folks will think, well, maybe we can do this. Governments will probably draw the opposite conclusion, and this is where it might have a negative effect as authoritarian regimes crack down harder on civil society, on opposition groups, shutting down the internet, Facebook, etc., in hopes that they can somehow stave off this kind of change. But clearly everyone is watching it, and it's extremely, extremely important for anyone who cares about promoting human rights and democratic change around the world that this go well. If it goes well over the next several months, and Egypt does emerge from it as a relatively democratic state that seems to be addressing the fundamental structural problems that it has experienced in the last 30 years, that will be a very powerful model. It will also be, it will have sort of an energizing effect, I think, on U.S. diplomacy around the world, because there will be a sense, I think, at the State Department and the White House that, well, we actually, we did something positive here. We helped do something positive. And by the same token, if it goes very badly, it will have a profoundly dispiriting effect on opposition movements and civil society around the world, and it will contribute to the sense in our own government that these kinds of efforts are futile, that there's really nothing we can do, that even when we put all our hearts into it and stake all of our leverage, in the end, we just don't have any influence anymore as a country. So, again, before we move on, it's really important that we get Egypt right, and we're not there yet. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tom. Larry?
Well, I think those were eloquent and deeply insightful remarks, and if you only thought of them on the way over, Tom, that's really impressive, but I don't think it was just on the way over. Anyway, I agree with everything you said, and so I'm going to try very hard not to repeat what you said, but I just strongly endorse every point you made. Let me begin by offering, mainly from the perspective of someone who thinks about these issues comparatively and certainly not an expert on Egypt or the Arab world, some reflections on what I think is hopeful about the situation in Egypt now, what I think is worrisome, and that will certainly echo some of the things that Tom has said, what I think needs to happen now, and then some implications for U.S. policy. And I'll try and make some comparative references to Tunisia on the way. First of all, I mean, you just can't watch the television, and I assume anybody in this room that's watching television is watching one of the same channels on the internet or on the networks that I am. You just can't watch it and not be moved. I think we are witnessing a profound world historical event, moment, process. What's happening now, well, first in Tunisia, now in Egypt, and who knows thereafter, in the year 2011, I think is going to be as important in world history as 1979, which of course went in a very bad direction in Iran, and we can't know that it won't in some of these countries, 1989 and 90 and 91, to a lesser degree, but let's not forget it, the historic transition in Indonesia, which generated democracy in the largest Muslim majority country. It's at that level. The hopeful signs are that, relatively unorganized but tech-savvy and fed-up young people in Egypt and expanding out to, much larger segments of the society have been able to sustain mobilization at this level. When I saw what happened last Friday, when I was worried that things were going to be shrinking and the regime was getting to the point where it might actually be able to clear the square in the dead of night with military force, I mean, my breath was just taken away. And the way new elements of society, labor, middle-class people, media practitioners who just get up and walk off the set are rallying to this movement, and the kind of democratic self-organization that's evident in the square itself, I just think is deeply impressive. Second of all, I would cite the relatively moderate and non-ideological character of this movement, which increasingly, I think as time goes on now, gives the lie to the obsession in some quarters in the West, which of course the Mubarak regime, maybe soon to be the whatever regime, the Omar Suleiman or NDP/military regime in Egypt, is constantly trying to manipulate and feed that, don't let the deluge come because it will be the Muslim Brotherhood sooner or later. There was a recent telephone poll done. I think it's full of methodological problems, frankly. You probably saw it, as I did, on the internet recently. But, it found about 15% support for the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, I think it was undercounting precisely the sorts of people who might give it more support, and certainly the more rural, illiterate, difficult to reach people who might also be a remaining base of support for the regime. But, even if it's higher, it's nowhere close to a majority, and they're not the driving force in the square there. And they don't need to become that, and this doesn't need to wind up becoming an anti-American movement if we stick to the kind of core principles, strategy, and so on that Tom outlined. More broadly, fear is gone, and of course the more they can sustain mobilization, the more it punctures the atmosphere of fear and intimidation, because you just can't arrest or destroy hundreds of thousands of people in the street at once. The problem is, I'll get to this in a minute, you also can't sustain that level of mobilization indefinitely. Also hopeful, I think, is that the military has acted with relative restraint, and I do underscore relative because, it's very hard to separate the military, the mukhabarat, the Interior Ministry, and the whole shadowy network. It's all really of one piece. And I totally agree with Tom's analysis that, when Mubarak does the deed in the next few minutes, it's probably going to have been the military and other elements of the regime pushing him out in order to save themselves. But now we come to what really worries me. Their goal is to save themselves. And the exploitation, the grotesque, probably corrupt to a degree that hasn't even begun to be documented, although I don't think that Mubarak's net worth is anywhere near $40 to $75 billion, as CNN was speculating. But just, they have been sucking this country dry for decades. And let's remember also, it didn't start when Mubarak became president 30 years ago. And the military sits on top of control of a large number of oligopolistic corporations in at best a semi-competitive economy. And it's not just corruption, it's a structural basis for rent-seeking that needs to be totally revised in order to create a dynamic modern economy. And I think there are things that can be done and should be done, I'll get to that in a moment, to forge a pact with the military and a pact with the old elite that will enhance their incentives to go along with a genuine democratic transition and raise their costs to not doing so. But, that can only succeed to a point. They are not going to have the opportunities, if the genuine democracy emerges in Egypt, to remain collecting the level of rents that they've been collecting. And eventually many of them are going to be retired, and, they can be guaranteed that they won't be prosecuted for their crimes, their murder, their torture, and their corruption. And that will probably need to be part of the deal, unfortunately, as it was in many Latin American transitions. But they're going to suffer severe costs, and the only way they'll yield, because every step of the way, if Omar Suleiman succeeds to whatever leadership position there is, even partially, this is one of the shrewdest political operators in Egypt today. And you can see how he's maneuvering now, just in the last 2 weeks, to try and contain this, steer it, gut it from within. And every political transitions with the goal of democracy have huge numbers of steps or decision trees. And at every step, the establishment, which he, I guess, is now probably the face of, will try and divert it with subtle means, with intimidation, and so on. So there's going to need to be, number one, the need for a degree of opposition organization and unity that is still so far lacking. Number two, a degree of opposition strategic thinking that I think we see signs of beginning to emerge, but is still, let's say, fragmented and underdeveloped. Tremendous vigilance from the United States and the international community to, one, ensure that the emergency is lifted, but even if the emergency is lifted, that people don't disappear in the dark of night, under other means or under no legal basis. I mean, let's say the emergency is lifted, other provisions aren't substituted. There's nothing to stop them from just organizing the same thugs and goons that rode through Tahrir Square on horseback and camel, 10 days ago or something, and just having them disappear people in the middle of the night or arrest them without any legal basis. This regime doesn't need a legal basis to visit terror, torture, and intimidation on democratic activists. So that's going to need to be very, very closely monitored. I personally feel the one thing that Egypt needs, the one indispensable thing that Egypt needs to get to democracy is freedom. Protection of human rights, of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, due process of law, habeas corpus, all those obvious things that Human Rights Watch is constantly monitoring. Because if there is a climate of freedom now, there's no way they can stop this thing. Because the minute Omar Suleiman, Minister Tantari, and the whole NDP establishment crowd try and steer this, divert it, pull it back, and so on, the people will be out on the streets again. It'll be their democratic right, and they'll be forced to, to honor the transition. So then there are some, serious pitfalls. Even, let's say, if the transition proceeds, let's say we get constitutional reform. Let's say we get neutral electoral administration. Let's say the legal right and obligation of the judges to supervise and monitor the elections is restored, as it was taken away late in 2005 when they got too good and serious at it. Let's say all of that happens. There's absolutely no guarantee that if there's a new presidential election, according to this poll, it won't be won by Mubarak light. And I think Amr Moussa, would not be as bad as some other alternatives, but would probably be a lighter version of, a hybrid or, semi-authoritarian system. And so this underscores the need for, first of all, opposition unity. I cannot say it often enough, emphatically enough. If they want to prevail, they've got to gather together under one coalition in front, pool their different strategies, nominate a single candidate for president this August or September, whenever the election is held. Secondly, I think in constitutional reform, my colleagues Alfred Stapon and Juan Lintz have emphasized this in an article that they've just written. The country needs to move, as Tunisia needs to move, away from presidentialism altogether. So you can't have a pharaoh emerge again. Look, in Iraq, power can be abused in a parliamentary system, and it certainly has been. The prime minister has been criticized and challenged for having concentrated too much power in his hands. But you can see he's just been forced to limit his own presence in the office, and it's just harder to do under a parliamentary system. So that should be prominent in the constitutional thinking about reform. I think the next presidential election, in short, should be the last in Egypt, and then there should be a transition to, and should be a transitional figure who leads a transition to a parliamentary form of government with proportional representation. Now, why do I want to say that? Because if you have a majoritarian electoral system in single-member districts or small-member districts with a majoritarian electoral rules, the two groups that are going to benefit for that are the ones that are already best organized, and they are the ruling party, the NDP, and the Muslim Brotherhood. And so you want to create a flexible arrangement where lots of different groups can emerge, mobilize for support, and win representation roughly in proportion to their level of support in society. I think systems that are too proportional have a lot of problems in Iraq, potentially in Egypt, certainly in Lebanon, and so on. But the danger of inflating the level of support of the NDP and the Muslim Brotherhood is, to my mind, clearly the greater danger now. And I've already spoken to the need for a negotiated, that is, pacted transition, which will give painful and significant assurances to representatives of the old order so that it doesn't become, for them, life or death. So at least they know they're not going to be hanging from a rope in Tahrir Square. Many of them will keep their positions in the military, keep their wealth. I think there's going to need to be down the road some kind of truth and reconciliation or accountability process. But, you know, they will fight to the death if they think the alternative is that they're going to The Hague or that they're going to wind up like Ceausescu. Now, let me close with some implications for U.S. policy. I think that we need to be careful to be forthright. Everything Tom said about the symbolism of what we do and say beyond the practical consequences is, I think, powerfully true. We have to be careful not to be seen to be or try to be in the lead on this, because it can't be about us. It has to be about the Egyptian people's struggle. But we have to be forthright in terms of where we stand. And some of the stupid and irresponsible statements that have been made by U.S. officials, I don't need to name them, you know who I'm talking about, and by a retired U.S. ambassador, you really know who I'm talking about, I think just have to stop, so there are no longer mixed messages. We have to stand for freedom. That's the most important thing, and for the principle of a genuinely democratic transition. And we should be doing and saying things in private that are even more forceful. I think one reason, this is pure speculation now, I have zero inside information, but as a political scientist, I'm kind of suspecting that one reason why what's about to happen is going to happen, it seems, and that the military has acted with restraint is because of private messages that the Obama administration is conveying now. I actually suspect that when the history is written, what the Obama administration is doing now, say in the last week or so, as opposed to the initial response, may actually be regarded rather well by historians when we have the full record. I think we can do a lot. We're trying at NED and in other places to do some things to help Egyptians understand some of the lessons from previous transitions, some of the options for constitutional and electoral system design, just to give people ranges of information and options. Two more things. One is, I think that the human rights situation will remain precarious in Egypt for a long time to come, because the last instrument that this regime has to save itself in anything like its current form is a return in one form or another of terror, torture, intimidation, and human rights violations in some way. I think there needs to be some kind of international, on-the-ground monitoring of the human rights situation in Egypt. I don't think it should be the United States or the EU. I think the Secretary General of the UN should be appointing a special representative to do that. And finally, we shouldn't neglect Tunisia. This is still a transition that could go either way. It's more hopeful in some respects than the Egyptian situation, because the military is smaller, not as tied to the old order, and has kind of, I'd say, been in a more favorable position toward political change, but nothing can be taken for granted there. And I will say, even if the Egyptian situation should turn back toward a hybrid, but for a while restabilized semi-authoritarian rule, if you got a genuine democratic transition in Tunisia in the next year or so, that would be the first democracy in the Arab world. And once there's one genuine, unambiguous case of electoral democracy in the Arab world, you can see the region is so ripe now for democratic change that it will have very, very powerful diffusion effects.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon. Thank you, Steve and POMED, for the invitation. It's always hard to go last because I do certainly agree with both Tom and Larry in their analysis. Some of what I'm going to say echoes what they've said. So I'll shorten my remarks just a little bit. But essentially, I would start off by saying, from my perspective, I really draw two key conclusions from what we've witnessed over the past month in Tunisia and Egypt. And frankly, on one level, it's hard to believe it's only been a month. It feels like it's been a lifetime if one considers the magnitude of the change. I completely agree that we're not after yet. We're not there yet. We're in the midst of. But my first comment would be, regardless of that, what we've witnessed is a watershed in the region from which there will be no return. In terms of, and I will unpack this a little bit more, but we are entering a new era in the Arab world. And one, I think, that is rife with dangers, but also very, very important opportunities to finally witness democratic transformation. The second point, and it's a little bit contradictory, or maybe a little bit pulling back, is that we have to be careful not to overstate the potential for a contagion effect. And I think that there's some sort of reflex to sort of think, oh my gosh, first Tunisia, now maybe Egypt, what comes next? And we'll talk about that, but I would just start by saying, let's be careful not to overstate that potential. In terms of the dramatic events unfolding now in Egypt and in Tunisia, I want to sort of underscore what I would find 6 key characteristics of those uprisings. And some of it is very much along the lines of what Larry's already said, so I won't try to spend too much time on it. But the first is that these are popular, organic, grassroots demonstrations that originate within the societies themselves. They're not imposed or inspired from the outside. This is not democracy by invasion. This is not democracy by a U.S. agenda. This is a genuine grassroots movement that originates within the country, and I think this homegrown aspect is what makes these uprisings particularly powerful and hopefully enduring in terms of the changes they bring. Secondly, the protests represent truly a broad spectrum of society. And again, this is a bit to Larry's point. It's not simply Islamists, not by a long shot. In fact, they're initiated by young, university-educated adults, but soon joined by the middle class, by women, by secularists, Islamists. This is the fabled Arab street, whose sort of existence for decades, I think, was in doubt. And I think we've actually seen it now make an appearance. Third, and this is precisely the point, that these uprisings have not been driven by Islamist opposition elements. In the past, during Algeria's brief experiment with democracy, it was Islamist groups, an Islamist party that was at the forefront of that. And we can talk about that perhaps in the question and answer, and that eventually, I would argue, led to its demise for many, many reasons. But I think it's important to note that there is not a key Islamist presence in these demonstrations. Fourth is the role of social media, technology, Wael Ghanim as sort of becoming this iconic figure, a young, tech-savvy, deeply committed Egyptian living in Dubai, who starts this Facebook page, which in turn begins to gather momentum and leads us to where we are. Again, I think we have to be careful not to overplay the role of social media. I think that the tragic story of Iran in the summer of the Iranian elections tells us that the Twitter revolution really did not come to pass, and those same instruments in the social media can be exploited by regimes to control and monitor. But nonetheless, it speaks to, I would say, this kind of 21st century dynamism that these Egyptians have brought to the fore, and it is really impressive to watch. Fifth is the notion that the demands in Egypt and in Tunisia have been very squarely focused on questions of governance, of freedom, of democracy, of bringing human rights to the fore, of putting an end to corrupt and autocratic regimes. These are not the bread riots that we saw and we've seen in Egypt and Algeria and elsewhere in the 80s and 90s. And that's a very, very important difference, because clearly, as we're seeing today in Egypt, the demands, they cannot be bought off by increasing subsidies, by increasing salaries. That's not going to do it. And these are very genuine and impassioned pleas for freedom and an end to torture and so forth. So I think that's notable. And finally, as was also noted, I would underscore the nonviolent attitude of the protesters. They are largely peaceful protests. These are not calls for the violent overthrow This is not al-Qaeda. This is not a call for jihad. And in fact, in many ways, I think what we're witnessing in Egypt and what we've seen in Tunisia is perhaps the most powerful antidote to al-Qaeda and its brand of extremism. I'm sure they are terrified by what they're seeing, because this is genuine power from the people. And so I think we should not underestimate that, and that's one reason in particular to help support these movements, to help support what's happening, purely from a U.S. interest. In terms of the regional regimes, let me turn to that and kind of how are they viewing this? Clearly, they are viewing it with some level of alarm. They are seeing and recognizing that there's a very powerful dynamic that's been unleashed that is propelling these uprisings. And we've seen, of course, not only in Tunisia and Egypt, but in Algeria, in Jordan, in Yemen, all have witnessed significant demonstrations and calls for change. Not on the same scale, but nonetheless, they've certainly gotten the attention of their leaders. And so as a result, we've seen some interesting measures that have taken place. In Algeria, for example, the 19-year-old emergency law is slated to be lifted. We'll see if it happens. And I think that's, frankly, something we have to say about every one of these measures that I'm going to list to you. It really depends on, do these leaders, in fact, follow through? In Jordan, King Abdullah dismissed his cabinet. He swore in a new government yesterday that is charged with enacting political reforms, in particular bringing to fore a new electoral law. But he, too, has increased subsidies, increased wages. So you see a mix of measures that are being undertaken. In Yemen, President Saleh has vowed not to run for re-election in 2013, nor to put forward his son, which is, I think, a significant shift. But he, too, has raised wages for the army, reduced income taxes. I mean, does this sound familiar? Promised to establish a fund to help employ university graduates and so forth. In Iraq, Prime Minister Maliki has cut his salary in half. He, too, has said that he will not run again in elections. Even Syria, probably one of the most autocratic regimes in the region, has lifted a 3-year ban on Facebook and YouTube, although it has been noted by human rights groups and others, and I would agree with this, that lifting of the ban could also be turned to the government's advantage in the sense that they can monitor dissidents and so forth. So again, to the second point now, that yes, the impact has been important, it's been significant, but I don't see a contagion effect per se. I don't think we're going to see uprisings from Morocco to the Gulf. There are certainly a number of common conditions that afflict the region, and they range from a lack of representative government, corruption, disproportionately young populations, high unemployment. I mean, it's a litany that I'm sure everyone in this room is familiar with. But I think it's really important to understand and evaluate each country on those conditions that are specific to it. And each of these countries are different. In particular, for me, one of the most intriguing questions has to do with the intangibles. And all these countries have the same sort of raw ingredients at play. But to my mind, it's the intangible of the loss of fear that's critical. And I don't think any of us, I certainly wouldn't pretend to understand how things tip and when and how it is that in populations anger trumps fear. We certainly saw it in Tunisia. We've seen it in Egypt, and I would agree it's very moving, frankly, to watch. But it's by no means a foregone conclusion that that's going to happen. And here again is the example of Syria, where there were anticipated protests to take place last week that did not materialize. And to my mind, that speaks to the very deep level of fear that grips that society by virtue of its very repressive security apparatus and so forth. Beyond the intangibles, there is also more broadly this question of monarchies versus republics. And I think to some degree, monarchies such as in Morocco and in the Gulf, of course I say this and who knows, tomorrow Morocco will go up, but that they may be more insulated from populist uprisings because of the nature of those systems of governance, the connection that's often forged of identity or tribe or whatever it might be between leaders and population. One exception to this, and I really, I'm not predicting this, but I think Jordan bears watching in the sense that it certainly does have an unpopular treaty with Israel. It has a large Palestinian population. It has many, many of the same issues at play. Is King Abdullah ahead of the curve? Is he really genuine? I have no idea, but I would say that in order for any of these countries, and I guess two that I would put out there to also watch would be Algeria, probably the most, and Yemen. They may see more precipitous change coming, and we'll see. We'll see what the effect of what's happening in Egypt now has on these other countries. But Algeria is a place where people, at least at one point, had lost that fear and have contested. And they do have many of the same problems. So I think Algeria certainly bears watching. Yemen too, but I think that the level of poverty in Yemen, it's so crushing. The levels of illiteracy and so forth may be such that and the fact that the people themselves are somewhat fractured might make it less likely that you see something in Yemen. I would say regardless, if regional regimes continue to use superficial measures, cosmetic reforms, short-term fixes that attempt to buy off opposition, they may find themselves to be the next Egypt or Tunisia. In terms of just last points here, U.S. response, again, from my perspective, we are faced in what we see today in Egypt with tremendous peril, but also an incredible opportunity. I mean, on one hand, what we're witnessing in Egypt, arguably, hundreds of millions or millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars of democracy promotion, assistance, and other things over several years we're not able to produce. And so we're seeing something that I think is remarkable in that way. But I would also argue, now comes the hard part, and very much would agree with both of my colleagues that we're nowhere near there yet, and this could also end badly. I think it very much depends on what happens in country and what the U.S. response is. I would really offer really two main ideas. One is I think that we need to leverage our influence with our European allies and work in concert with them as well. I don't know how much of that has happened to date, but I think that it's important for us and the Europeans to work together on this. And secondly, I think this is a very important opportunity for us to reach out to various groups militating for change, and that would include moderate Islamist organizations like the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamic Action Front in Jordan. We've shied away from these groups for years. I think under the current context, this is an important time to begin to think about engaging with them. And I just want to close with one last thought, and that is what we're witnessing today is truly momentous, but it's not the first time that the Middle East or the Arab world has witnessed a democratic opening, nor is it the first time that we've seen a genuine popular uprising. We saw a very interesting and very real, although aborted, experiment with democracy in Algeria in the late 80s and in the early 90s. And we saw a genuine populist uprising in Lebanon in 2005, which 1 million Lebanese people, a quarter of the population, went to the streets, and we can talk about there are all kinds of conditions. These are very different on many levels, but they succeeded in forcing the Syrian military to withdraw from that country after 30 years of occupation. However, both of those momentous events have sort of receded from our memories, and that's because they faltered significantly. And I think they are potent reminders of how important it is to understand the dynamics on the ground, how important it is for the United States to remain engaged, but to be bold and innovative in its approach to the region. And I'll leave it at that.